TSA Oxford 2020, question 16. This question is asking us to find which of the following best expresses the main conclusion of the above argument being here. This is one of the most popular formats, the types of critical thinking questions on the TSA. Probably about 20 to 25% of the critical thinking questions will be asking you to identify the main conclusion. The TSA would like you to know that you need to pick out which sentence in the passage is the main conclusion. So the main conclusion is in the passage itself. It's not something you have to make up. It's not something you have to deduct or derive or somehow create yourself. It's in the passage already. The statement that what we're looking for, the statement which follows from or is supported by the rest of the passage. So whatever answer you choose, make sure it follows from or is supported by what you read in the passage. All right, let's go ahead and read this passage. Sometimes we are mistreated by others, and forgiveness is one kind of response to those who wrong us. However, sometimes we do things that appear to be morally wrong, but in fact are not. If we are reproached, we can give an explanation for our action that justifies it. In these cases, we are claiming that, despite appearances to the contrary, what we did was morally permissible. Forgiveness and justification ought to be distinguished. When conduct is justified, the implication is that it was not morally wrong, but when conduct is forgiven, there is no such implication. What we are forgiven for is the morally wrong things we do. Okay, interesting. So the passage is, I'm reading, it's a little bit confusing for me. It's sort of a philosophical argument, and I've already sort of, by the time I finished the passage, I already forgot what I read at the beginning. But what I'm drawn to is the last sentence. We are forgiven for is the morally wrong things we do. Let's see. When conduct is forgiven, there's no such implication. Okay, I see. So it's arguing that forgiveness and justification are two different things. Let's see. Okay, so which of the following best expresses the main conclusion of the above argument? A, sometimes we do things that appear to be morally wrong, but in fact are not. So that's not really a conclusion. I feel like that's part of the reasoning that would support a main conclusion, but that doesn't sound like a conclusion to me, especially when A is sort of paraphrased in the passage itself. So that's not really there. Forgiveness and justification ought to be distinguished. Okay, well, I did underline that earlier. It does sound like a possible main conclusion, because most of the passage is explaining why the two ought to be distinguished, right? So it's saying that there are some things that appear to be morally wrong, but in fact are not, and that forgiveness is one kind of response. It also, after the argument for the distinguishing of the two things, it talks about how things that you're forgiven for are the morally wrong things that you do. So this might be the answer. C, what we are forgiven for is the morally wrong things we do. Yeah, that kind of leads into this argument, right? It's basically saying that, okay, if what we are forgiven for is the morally wrong things we do, then that's different from the things that we try to justify, right? So this kind of actually supports the top argument, so it can't be the main conclusion if it's actually a pillar supporting a different possible main conclusion. So it's not C. D, forgiveness is one kind of response to those who wrong us. That's not really a conclusion. Doesn't sound like a conclusion at all. And that's not really what the passage is arguing, right? It's the passage starts off by explaining that forgiveness is one kind of response, and it goes on to say that forgiveness and justification ought to be distinguished. So this is only the first part of a bigger argument. This can't be the whole main conclusion. So it's not D. E says when conduct is justified, the implication is that it was not morally wrong. Okay, this is interesting. But this is kind of tagging onto D, right? We just said D is talking about what forgiveness is. E is talking about what justification is. So this is again feeding into B, which argues that the two things ought to be distinguished. And B, C, D, and E are basically justifying the argument expressed in B that forgiveness and justification ought to be distinguished. So it's not E because E is supporting B. I'm going to have to go with B as my final answer.